And so, Bill, you're free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I was lucky enough to be able to work in the Shasta River in a really, I guess, fortunate capacity. We were charged with trying to understand how coho made a living in the Shasta River. Where do they rear? What conditions did they need to survive? And when I started doing this, we knew coho lived here, but we didn't really know how they did it. For example, if you went out in the summertime to access the Shasta River and look for juveniles, you wouldn't find them because everywhere we went, the water was too warm. One time of the year that we would see them would be in the springtime when they'd be leaving. We operate a rotary trap at the mouth of the Shasta River. This photograph is taken in the upper watershed where there's quite a bit of spring inflow. And this is kind of an idyllic place where I guess it's their coho's happy spot. The water is pretty shallow. You're looking at the surface right there. And the water is very calm. It's very low velocity. They have a preference for that. They have a really specific requirement for habitat. And they have an unfortunate life history. And I say unfortunate because it collides directly with the way humans want to use the water in the Shasta River. So for a full 18 months of their life, they're in fresh water, unlike Chinook salmon, which want to leave the water, the tributary, and get down to the ocean sooner and do most of their rearing down there. Coho will spend typically the first 18 months in the tributary. So they're subject to all kinds of things over the summer, low flow conditions and high temperatures. Let's see if I can make this work for me. Oh, that's not working. Anyway, that works. Can you guys see the top of the title, or is that blocked out?
Right now I see Shasta River juvenile coho. Yeah. Yep. It just
what we know about the Shasta River, can you read that?
Yep. It just changed. So you're right on track.
Okay. So this is a whole assemblage of different projects, field projects and studies that have been going on. Some of them have been going back on since 1930. Some of them have been going on since 2020. But including the adult counting weir, which is operating right now, which counts adult salmon and steelhead coming back usually from early September, some years as late as December, some years into November. It's different. It's over the time. It's been different every year. With a rotary trap, we operate a trap at the mouth of the river. Started in 2000, and would collect juveniles and produce estimates of production. So just in a nutshell, that you catch a known number of fish, and you're going to put a mark on them that's going to make them distinct. So in some cases, we'll dye them, actually change their color with a temporary dye. And don't do it with all the fish, but we'll just do like a known number, like say 100 of them. And then we'll release them back upstream with the trap, and we'll see how many of those marked fish we recapture. And that'll give us the trap efficiency, because we know we're not catching all the fish. But if I release 100 fish and I catch 30 of them back, I'm going to say that I'm 30% efficient. And then I look at my total number that I caught, and I say that represents 30% of the total number of fish leaving the river. There's some assumptions there, but it's a really useful tool for understanding the timing of fish emigrating, going to the Klamath, and in terms of the numbers of fish that are leaving. And it can also be used along with adult numbers that are coming back. So you can understand the relationship between adults produced and or juveniles produced and adults returning. We did radio tagging of adults migrating upstream. For about 4 or 5 years, we captured adults that were coming upstream and planted radio tags, esophageal radio tags, and then looked for those tags, overflew the watershed and looked for where those tags were found. Pit tagging of juveniles, this was a really powerful tool as well. It's where you'd implant a little, it's identical to the RFID tags that are being used for identifying pets. It's a transponder. It doesn't have a battery in it, but when it runs through an electric field, it'll emit a unique code. And so it'll tell you where that individual is and when. It'll be recorded on a time and date stamp. So you basically can track where these fish are throughout the watershed in a way, once they're tagged without having to handle them repeatedly. And then we've done watershed-wide temperature monitoring. We deployed, I think, 50 different temperature monitors throughout the watershed that would help us understand what was going on with water temperature. So all these studies combined to produce quite a bit of data. And that was funded by the Bureau of Reclamation in Klamath Falls, Shasta Valley RCD, Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, the Fisheries Restoration Grants Program, the Department of Fish and Game, as well as private donors and cooperators. So it was a large assemblage of groups and people and effort. And over the years, literally hundreds of people have been involved in assembling this data set. So it's not, we know a fair bit about the Shasta River and coho and where they live in the watershed. So I just wanted to start out by talking about the status of cohorts and present day run size. So a cohort is coho have a life history that very typically they're going to take 3 years, a 3-year life cycle. So they'll come back as adults, say in 2021, they're going to spawn and lay their eggs. The eggs are going to come out of the gravel in spring of 2022, and then they're going to rear until spring of 2023, an entire year before they'll leave as age 1 fish, 1+ fish, and they'll go out to the ocean. They'll stay in the ocean for 18 months, and then they'll come back as a 3-year-old. There's a few exceptions to that, but by and large, that's what they're doing. So you can track because of that, they don't intermix. So like on Chinook salmon, they can mature anywhere from ages 2 to 5. So every given brood year is made up of different age fish. Whereas with coho, it's almost exclusively 3-year-olds. There's a few 2-year-olds, but mostly on coho salmon. So what you're seeing on a run of coho is the results of what's happened to that one brood year. You're not combining brood years, if that makes sense. I think this will help a little bit. So this is we're going to call this arbitrarily cohort A. So these guys came back when the first year we started counting coho at the weir. We had 291 fish come back. And then the next generation, when those came back as adults, we actually increased the number of fish that went up to 373 adults. And then since then, it's been a downward sled till, we're at 50 is in 2019. That was the last number for that particular cohort. Here's cohort B that started in 2002. And you can see it was always kind of depressed. That we never had more than 100 since we started counting. Historic numbers on coho is probably never more than a couple of thousand in the Shasta River. But those counts were actually done pretty well after habitat has been impacted. So we don't really have any true estimates of what coho used to do before the river was so heavily impacted by agriculture. But anyways, this is where we are with cohort B, and this is cohort C. So these guys, this is the cohort that's returning this year. Last came back in 2018, coming back in 2021. We'll see what they get. But you can see it goes up and down quite a bit. There's a fair bit of variability here. But as a rule, they're all trending downwards. And there's a couple things that are problematic here, because as you drop the number of adults, it gets harder and harder. Reproduction will become less successful because we'll talk about it in just a second here. But there's not enough fish that can find each other. All cohorts are trending downwards. This table is all 3 of those cohorts are represented here by different colors. So the green is the cohort A starting in 2001. The gray is cohort B, and the C is 2003. The cohort started in 2003. And just for a second, let's take a look at this. So you've got the first year we started doing this, we had 291 adults come back, and that produced 12,000 smolts in 2003. So you guys, thumbs up. Does that make sense in terms of tracking that cohort? Is that understandable? Cool. So smolts per adult is just looking at the number of 1+ fish that leave as a result of the adults that came back in the brood year back. So in 2003, 44 smolts were returned per returning adult. So we had if each of these 291 fish, it's obviously the males aren't laying eggs, but it's just kind of it's an index, I guess you could say. So, but anyways, you can see this number is all over the place. Some years it's 44, some years it's as high as 81. Some years it's as low as 2 or even 1, and so this kind of makes you scratch your head, like what is going on in this watershed? Why are these numbers? This is not normal. Let me put it that way. I mean, in a healthy, robust population, I don't think you would see this kind of variability. But I really don't. I haven't worked with a robust population of coho, but my assumption is that this wouldn't be going on. And I know you don't see it for Chinook. You don't see this kind of variability, and so it makes you wonder. The fate of these animals must vary from year to year. The conditions in this watershed must be really different because everything that's happening from adults to here in 2008 to juveniles here in 2010, that all took place in fresh water. It all took place in the watershed. There's no El Nino, there's no Japanese fishing boats or any of the other stuff that people are always getting excited about. This is completely within the fresh water of the Shasta River. If you plot all this number of smolts produced on the y-axis and adults on the x, you'll see that there's some obvious trends, like you get a lot of adults come back is going to produce a lot of juveniles. 12,000 is produced by 350 adults. But then you get down into this part of the chart, and it's weird because now you're getting like the same number of adults coming back on the x-axis is producing a wide range of smolts, all the ways from 4,000 down to 1 or 2, and so that indicates that something's not working the same from year to year. So causes of variable number of smolts per adult, depensation. That's really when the fish can't find each other. There's a number of things as populations become smaller and are shrinking, collapsing. There's some of the things they're not. There's no competition between the fish. They can't find each other. There's a whole cluster of things that are going on. None of them are good, and they're hard to get out of. You kind of enter into what they're calling like an extinction vortex. The population just starts to collapse because they can't. Literally, if you get fish coming back over a 2-month span and you've only got single-digit number of adults coming back into the river, the likelihood of them finding each other in the watershed is not very good, let alone building a redd. And so you've got very few chances of reproduction going on. Environmental conditions, are another thing that changes from year to year. But because this is a watershed that's fed by cold springs, it's not like it would be affected by drought per se, because these fish have a real affinity for cold water. So you're not going to, the cold water's there year in, year out. So something else is going on. So it leads us to the bottom line, the question of what are the causes of the low production years? So we know that this is a compilation of literature values, but the optimal water temperature for rearing juvenile coho is between 10 degrees C and 15.5 degrees C. So it's like, that's in the 50s to I think low 60s. I'm sorry, I don't have a Fahrenheit equivalent of it, but it's chilly. It's not super cold, but it's a scarce commodity, cold water in this part of the country in the summertime. And you get it from snowmelt, of course, but the springs are really just an incredible match with these fish. That's why that's why coho have done so well here, is because we have these springs. In that optimal water temperature range, the fish have positive growth rate. Their swimming performance is optimized. They have a resistance to disease. It's in the optimal level. And importantly, pathogens have a reduced virulence within this range. And it's no small matter. These fish helps to really boost their reproduction. Suboptimal is between 15.6 and 20.3. So in this range, the fish will still grow. The respiration is increased dramatically above 15.6. now there's the diseases are doing better. And above number 4 here, above 15.5, temperatures begin to trend towards optimal range of competing warm water fish that are in the watershed, non-native fish like bass and other species that will prey on salmon. So you're getting into the operating range of some fish that are competing with the coho, and which is number 5 there. So just to look at a table there that's got that. So here's optimal 10 to 15.5, suboptimal 15.5 to 20.3, and detrimental is there's a detrimental. You can be too cold, -4, less than 4.4, which doesn't happen here, or you can be above 20.3 degrees C. I want to say 20.3. Maybe one of you guys can, on your calculator, can come up with 20.3 for me. What that is? I want to say it might be 66, 67, somewhere in that ballpark. Anyways, it's not a warm water temperature you'd think, but these animals are have evolved under for these to work well under cold water conditions, which is why they're not doing very well. This is a chart of the hydrograph from the Shasta River, and the blue line represents what is called unimpaired flow. So if you took away all the consumptive uses of the water, diversions, irrigation of crops, and you just let the water flow. This is the month that you would see. This kind of generally has people scratching their head if they're new to the area, because when you come here in May and June, this chart is saying that that's when you should be having flows of almost 400 cubic feet per second. There's different versions of this. There's people attempt this by pulling out the evapotranspiration from the crop and from the diversions, but I don't think it's far off. This was based on rainfall data, and it was compiled by Bill Bennett with Department of Water Resources. But anyways, instead of that blue hydrograph that's peaking in May and June and July, we're seeing that's when it's really crashing here, is in April when the irrigation season starts. And we're seeing flows as low now as last summer. We had flows that were less than 4 cubic feet per second. You'd have a hard time seeing that on the graph. Basically, it'd be just above 0. And so and these aren't natural flows. These are flows that are left in the channel after agriculture has taken the water that they want. So the upper watershed has these springs that I was talking about. There's Big Springs Creek that was just recently purchased by the Department of Fish and Wildlife from the Nature Conservancy, and it's got springs in the channel as well as at the upper end of it, and there's a number of springs in the channel as well. Then there's Little Shasta. Little Springs Creek, which is a tributary to Big Springs Creek, which isn't showing up on this chart. This is the Shasta River main stem. There's main stem springs that are adjacent to that. And then there's a number of springs that are in the channel below Juvenile Dam. There's Kettle Springs, which is a tributary to Parks Creek, and there's Bridgefield Springs. We'll be talking about these springs in just a little bit. But anyways, these springs are year-round, cold water, and an optimal temperature range. 13 degrees is what they're chugging out. And the volumes are small. The Kettle Springs is 5 CFS. Cubic feet per second. Clear Springs is like 3 or 4 cubic feet per second. But the coho there's not a lot of coho in the system to begin with. And they can work with small volumes, providing the water doesn't get interrupted by either diversion. So here's you guys can read that title still? Is that right? Every known source of, mine's blacked out by some a menu up here at the top.
Yes, we can see that title.
I'll put this down here. Maybe that's better. Does that help you guys see that at all, or is that?
We can't see whatever. We only see your presentation. So
all right. So every known source of cold water in the Shasta River is impacted by one of the or more of the following 5 things. There's diversion from the springs themselves. There's impoundment of the springs, which is like the very first thing that people did when they came to this country. And because you got this cold water, just like it's like magic. This stuff's coming out of the ground. It's good quality cold water, drinking water quality. You build a berm around it to make a lake out of it, so that you can gather it quickly. You can release it all at once. And all these things have the effect of warming the water. So and pounding it will show, there's a chart here that shows what it does to temperature, but it really increases the temperature quickly. There's tailwater, which is water that's been applied to the field that comes back into the channel or into the spring itself, and that'll warm the water up. There's mixing with water released from Lake Shastina. So there's springs in the channel of the Shasta River, but when the water from Juvenile or Lake Shastina is released for use downstream for irrigation water, it comes in on, they're using the Shasta River channel as a conduit, and they're swamping the cold springs that are in the river with the cold water. I mean, with the warm water. And some of this water is like really warm, like 25, 26 degrees C. So it's you put that on top of 13-degree water, and it doesn't take long before you destroyed that cold water habitat. There's nowhere limited access to cold water rearing habitat below the spring. That'll keep it from being used as well. It'll still be coming out of the ground, but the fish can't get to it because of artificial barriers that have been, or modifications to the channel. This is a canyon. This is just an overview of where coho are found spawning in the Shasta River. So this is the Klamath River down here. This is Parks Creek, and this is the upper watershed. So the area I was showing you, the springs, is pretty much included inside that upper circle. In the canyon, we see coho spawning as well. These fish are unable to rear. They need to leave the canyon and move into the Klamath River straight away. They're not going to be able to spend the summer here because the water just gets too warm. And some of the reasons, like, well, why are they spawning there? Some of it could just be natural variation in what the fish are doing to make a living. More than likely, they're fish that are straying into the watershed and are spawning. Iron Gate has stopped collecting coho. Where they release coho that they don't need, that are surplus to their operation, and they're allowing those fish to go downstream. And some of them are straying into the Shasta River. So we might be seeing Shasta River or Iron Gate coho in there as well. So I wanted to take you through a brood year and tell you about what the fish are doing at different seasons. So just for this example, we're going to use 2010. We had 44 adults come back, and they laid their eggs in the gravel in November and December of 2010. This is where they did it for the most part. They spawned some of them in the canyon, like we were talking about, but this is a compilation of 2008 to 2011 data. So we had coho that were spawning in Big Springs Creek itself, in the Shasta River below Big Springs Creek, and the Shasta River above Big Springs Creek, and in the lower end of Parks Creek, and strangely enough, way up here in the Parks Creek, 4 or 5 miles upstream. And when you was going to take a look at that, you'll see why it's strange. We didn't have any spawning in this part of the watershed due to low flow. There's very little water released out of Dwinell Dam in the fall. The springs are driving the spawning. They're providing water for the fish to get in there and find it. So now those fish lay their eggs in the gravel in November, December, or January. Come around to April and May of 2011. Now the fish are going to come out of the gravel and they're going to disperse. So they're going to if you went out with a mask and snorkel, you would find fish rearing in all these areas with orange, below Big Springs Creek, below Clear Springs. In Parks Creek itself, this would be seeded with juveniles that have come out of the gravel and they're ready to start growing and rearing. Then what happens next is the river's going to get warm due to the start of irrigation season, and some of it's just occurring naturally. And so fish are going to have to move from this area of this initial dispersal where we found them in April and May, and now they're going to have to move into summer rearing habitat. They're going to have to find some place that's going to stay cold all summer. And so what that looks like is, if you go in the summertime, you'd find fish in Big Springs Creek. You would find them in the main stem below Clear Springs. We found them below these springs, not directly in the spring, but just downstream of the springs, and in Kettle Springs below here. They've been blown out of Parks Creek itself because it's become way too warm, and they don't have access into Bridgefield the way things are managed right now. So it's a pretty small range of where you find these fish. And once we understood, it's like, oh, that's why we could never find where coho were rearing, because we never had access into anywhere above about here in the Shasta River. So we'd see these juveniles coming out in the springtime, but we had no idea where they were coming from until we did this work. And So now you've got the fish, they've been rearing in the summer. Now it's October, November of 2011. They're no longer limited to or restricted to areas where there's cold water. Now they could literally find them throughout the watershed. But instead of being confined right below the spring, now they're going to stretch out all the way down through here. And you're even going to find them a little bit up in here. You're going to find some of them lower in the Shasta River itself. So you got winter rearing that comes next. Now their behavior is changing too. They're starting to school up in groups. They're starting to, in the springtime, they're going to start to develop into smolts. And by March and April of 2012, they're going to be ready to go to the ocean. So this is a case study of what happened to a group of fish that were rearing in the Clear Spring area on the main stem. We had fish in Big Springs Creek, we had fish in Parks Creek, but we just identified this population of fish that was rearing near Clear Springs, and we put as many tags in these fish, and so we could confirm that they were alive at this point prior to their emigration to the Klamath River in the springtime. So that yellow represents their course that they're going to go. So this is Clear Springs. It's a beautiful little spring, about 3 CFS of 13-degree water year round, coming out of it empties right into the channel. So it's right adjacent to the channel, and the water. And this is what it looks like below. This is that first initial photo that I showed you guys. The habitat's ideal for coho to rear there. This is what it looks like underwater. It's just this. These fish are. This is the spring of the year, so these fish are pretty. They're huge for coho, for a 1+ coho, and they're just hanging out in this almost zero velocity water, drift feeding as the flow, as bugs and critters will fly by. They'll just dart up. This guy's in the process. If he sees something, he's going to gash up here and grab something, and he's going to come back down and take his place in line. This is a beautiful spot, and it's ideal for coho. This is what the river looks like downstream of in the middle of April. So this is right at the height of their migration period. This is how low the flow is here, probably less than 2 cubic feet per second. There's a beaver dam down here just at mile 36 as well. And you can see how thin the water is down below that beaver dam. So I guess this is what happens to, this is a model of survival, smolt survival estimate. So you start with 100% up here, and by the time you get down here, you've got 50% of your 100% is left. You've lost 43% of your fish. And by the time you reach the mouth, and this is another 35 miles to the mouth, but in 1.5 miles, you've lost a high proportion of your fish. So high mortality rate through this very small and very short duration. These fish have been living here for 18 months, and now in the space of a week, you've lost 43% of them. And so this is what, sorry, my Labrador barking. This is what it looks like. This is a little model. This is prepared by Chris Adams, and I think I can make this play. There it goes. So we've lost 60% of our fish here. We have 40% of our fish made it to the Klamath River, but that's a really high mortality to take place so quickly. Yeah, that's pretty much the story there. So the missing piece of this study was the smolt survival estimates are only available from one location, and the survival through other life stages was unknown. So Chris worked for us. He's part of the project in 2006 and 7, and he really pioneered some of the work along with Kerry Morrow, who lives down in South County. And these guys developed a technique for using pit tags with pit tag antennas to track the survival and movement of what these coho were doing within the watershed. So you could track individuals, and it was really an informed monitoring. It kind of was the leaps and bounds ahead of the way fish biology would estimate things. Instead, you could have individual behaviors in migration. And so he went on to do a thesis over at HSU with these, and there's he came up with. If you have I have a copy of his thesis if anyone's interested in reading it. It's really interesting, and all the the technology is available and still, can be used to help understand what's going on with coho. But essentially, this, I don't want to try to get through it, but there's like, he modeled different states of where the fish were surviving, whether they were, he had different locations and different seasons. And what he found was that the distribution of rearing and juvenile coho changes seasonally. So they're not going to be just stuck in one spot on one piece of habitat. They're going to be all over the watershed. They're going to cross people's property lines and use different parts of the watershed at different times. It's just like you'd expect a wild animal to do. They're not there. So if you do, some people were hoping that, they were a little bit more, I guess, limited in their movement. So you fix one place up, you'd be good enough. But they literally need the whole watershed, which is why they're in such trouble. Regardless of where coho emerged from the gravel or reared during the summer, they're going to be they will be widely distributed through the upper Shasta River before the immigration starts in the spring. So that means the whole watershed really needs to be ready for them to get out, or at least the parts of the watershed that they need to pass through. Small migration is underway when irrigation season begins, and successful small irrigation requires suitable habitat conditions, both flow and temperature through the entire range of the migration route. And that's where this expression of one bad day, and one bad reach is all it takes to lose a large chunk of your production. The monitoring needs, we need to be able to determine where fish are spawning and where the juveniles are rearing. We need measurements of real-time flow and water temperature. We need a pit tagging study that estimates survival by location so we can have informed management. So if fish aren't doing well in a particular landowner or a particular portion of the river, then we need to figure out, why, what's going on with the water temperature or conditions there that's causing those fish to not survive. Location and quantity of the water diversions and return flow to the river. We don't have any information like that. Catherine, we're burning through time like crazy, and I wonder what you would like to do. I have other stuff I'd like to keep going on, but I don't want to blow the thing up.
Yeah, I'd like for you to continue. I think we'll keep going until about like 6 or later, but I think as far as your presentation is concerned, we'd all love to hear what you have to say.
Okay, I recognize what going into this thing that it's really hard to compress this and still tell the story. And I didn't think you guys wanted that. I mean, I would rather tell you about this and then take my lumps. So if you need to sign off, I understand. This is a cool map. This is I think it's a 1900 or 1910 topo map of the Shasta Valley. And what it shows here is Parks Creek watershed. So this is the Wairika irrigating ditch. It's kind of funny, but these areas here are mapped. Those are springs. Those are roughly wetland. Those are wetland fed springs. Spring fed wetlands. Getting rummy here. This is the Shasta River. This is all underneath Juvenile right now. This is Parks Creek right here. And this is the mouth of Parks Creek and the Shasta River together. But this area circled in orange had to be just a spectacular site for producing coho, because what they like is that extended cold water rearing habitat with abundant food. And that's exactly what you've got there. You've got a wetland that's going to just be providing all kinds of rearing habitat for these fish. And so, we're going to talk about what this area looks like here today. This is all underwater under Juvenile. So we'll have to use our imagination on that. We did radio tagging studies starting in 2004, and I think for about 6 or 7 years. Mary Olswang and Byron Littleton did some of this work, Mark Pisano, and the fish were captured at the weir. And this is the antenna sticking out of the fish's mouth. So that's the esophageal tag. There's no surgery involved. You just literally put it down its gut. And these fish aren't at a point, they're at a point in their lives where they're not eating and feeding anymore. So I'm sure they don't like it, but it doesn't seem to keep them from doing what they want to do, which is get upstream and spawn. So that's a good looking coho there that's on its way upstream. So the radio tags, then you fly over the watershed in an airplane with an antenna. And these are all the sites that we're getting detections. So this was surprising because we didn't know where these fish were going, and we didn't have access, and we didn't really have the money or the labor to walk around the entire watershed looking for these fish. But when you fly overhead and this thing's pinging off, you're getting detections. So here you're getting detections in Parks Creek up here. Then you're getting detections at the mouth of Big Springs Creek, and here's the Shasta River above Park Spring and the Martha Parks Creek. So this is where our tagged adults are going. When you go up on Parks Creek, this is what it looks like. And every person who's familiar with coho over on the coast, when those are the folks I was working with, they would look at me and say, "You got to be kidding! Coho aren't gonna. That's a desert. Coho aren't going to spawn there." This is why these fish are so cool in my mind, because part of the evolutionary significant unit, the Southern Oregon Northern SONC, it's called SONCC, which is these fish are a part of. These fish are utilizing habitat that is no other population is using. This is like high desert, and we've got coho that are spawning here. And you look at that and say, how is that possible that these fish are rearing in this location? So this is a red circled here in red. How you can see there's gravel here. This is a little bit deeper here. This is clean gravel. This is finer gravel. And so the fish, what she does is she comes in, she faces upstream, and with her caudal fin, her tail, she works this gravel up and causes it to be carried by the current and drop in here. The male comes in behind her and fertilizes the eggs. And underneath this pile of gravel here, that clean gravel, is where the eggs rear and develop until the juveniles emerge. But you can see that this landscape is wide open and really subject to a lot of warming once the temperatures increase. Location of coho spawning in 2004, 7, 8, and 10. So we had, let's see, this is a good deal of spawning take place on Parks Creek here, circled in red. This is Kettle Springs. We'll talk about that. The main stem Shasta River is over the hill here, down below here. So way up in Parks Creek is where we're finding these fish. These are the diversions on Parks Creek. There's, before you get down to Bridgefield and Kettle, you get all these different diversions are pulling water out of the river. And these are stockwater diversions in the wintertime, and they're also diversions that are occurring in the summertime. This is the section of Parks Creek that we had spawning taking place in. These are some of the diversions, and these are winter stockwater diversions that are operating when fish are trying to spawn as well as trying to rear. These ranches that I'm talking about here are all part of the Safe Harbor Agreement. We haven't talked about Safe Harbor, but it's an effort to exempt landowners from regulatory oversight in exchange for improved spawning habitat and spawning and rearing habitat. And it's a federal program, and it has the potential to lock in and protect some practices that are the cause of this decline of the Shasta River fish. But anyways, these are diversions that I'm showing you. You can see the water's this is a screen here that sieves the water out, the fish from the water. This is what it looks like. That's I-5 there. This is water coming downstream. This is a push-up dam, as we call it. You get your loader out there and you dump a bunch of gravel in here, and what it does is it forces water down this ditch, and it leaves this trickle of water to go downstream. The fish are trying to spawn when this is taking place, and this is really it's a real obstacle for these fish. Not only are you introducing a lot of fines into the channel, but this is what is going on. So that water that was in the channel is now heading out into a pasture to water these cows, to water stock. There's other ways to do this. There just has to be a better way to operate. This is Parks Creek, right in the heart of where all that spawning is taking place. This is the red area here is where that diverted water is going to water those cows. This ranch is thousands of acres. Why do these cows have to be out here watering when these critical time period for these fish is a mystery to me. This is spring, summer, fall irrigation season on Parks Creek. So this is we're focusing on Parks Creek because we know a little bit more about it, and it's a key piece of habitat. So this is a little corner of Lake Shastina. Over the ridge, you've got this spring here called Bridgefield Springs. It's been an impoundment's been built around it. This is Parks Creek running down here. This is the confluence of Bridgefield Springs coming into Parks Creek, and Parks Creek comes all the way down. This is Kettle Springs, an important spring where the fish go. And way down here is where it hits the Shasta River. And this is all one property owner that has this, and they're part of the Safe Harbor Agreement. And what they've done here is they've made arrangements to release 3 CFS out of this spring, which is good. But the 12 to 15 CFS coming out of this They're at as of the last time I looked at their plan for safe harbor, there was no action being taken to do anything with this once wetland habitat. This is a 1978 map, topo map, I think, or maybe even an 83 topo map. And you can see they're still mapping springs in here. This is a wetland, and it continues to try to be a wetland in spite of what's going on with it. So let's take a look at this from the air. This is from Google Earth in 2009. This is Lake Shasta. This is the Parks Creek watershed where those springs are. We're going to zoom in here. This is Parks Creek. It's been channelized. This used to be the marsh, and you'd have a spring-fed marsh in here. This is the springs are emerging all along the base of the slope as well as down in here. So if you can try to imagine this, what this looked like prior to this ag development. So it's now we're going to zoom in here a little. This is an impoundment that's been built to capture that spring water. This is a map of a survey that we did in 1995. I personally did it in 1995. You see there's this little spring right here at number 2. There were Chinook salmon spawning in this spring. We walked up this channel. Parks Creek, I don't remember if we surveyed Parks Creek or not. I know we surveyed this channel. This is what it looked like. That's me when I was younger. This is a little spring right there, and there were Chinook spawning right in this channel. This is what it looks like today. What they did is they bulldozed all this material up and they captured that spring to include it in this big reservoir impoundment. And what they'll do in there is they'll store water up until they get as much head as possible, and then they'll dump it all at once, and they'll create like a flow across that meadow, just to inundate it, to swamp it. And what that looks like from the meadow is like this. So that impoundment we were looking at is at the toe of the slope. Here comes the water across the field. They'll use tarps and they'll use piles of sediment to stop that water and keep it perched on the ground. But eventually, even doing that, that's a bigger view. That's the same slope where the impoundment is. And this is under full irrigation from the impoundment as well as from the diversion of Parks Creek. And so you end up with this dark, sick-looking water that's warming and it's loaded with nutrients. This is I'm now looking back upstream on the Shasta River. This is that's a levee that's been built to capture springs. This is Parks Creek itself right there that's been channelized. Remember, this used to be a marsh, spring-fed marsh, and now it's been channelized and turned into a pasture. But you've got huge numbers of livestock that are literally waiting out in here. And as a result, you got densities of cattle on here that are contributing to eutrophication of the water. You got culverts that are set too high. So you got spring water that's starting out at 13 degrees is turning into literally sewage, 25, 26 degree sewage by the time it comes back to the Shasta, to the Parks Creek. Is it any wonder coho don't exist here, aren't doing very well? This is a study that was done by David's Engineering that showed that on this pasture that we just looked at, 40% of the water wasn't being even used by plants. It was running off. This was crop evapotranspiration that was being estimated. All this stuff is still being permitted with the safe harbor agreement for this landowner. None of this stuff has been corrected. And it's all they're just burying their head and saying, well, look what he's doing downstream. They're giving away 3 CFS. Why don't you just, look at that and don't pay attention to what's happening. Summary of impacts, land and water management practices on the Shasta Springs Ranch, Hole in the Ground Ranch, Bridgefield Springs, and Black Meadow. They're blocking access to spawning habitat. They're elevating water temperatures to significant cold water springs. They're blocking access to very limited over summer rearing habitat. They're producing a terrific amount of nutrient loading and elevating water temperatures based on the David's Engineering study. This was all put together in our 2010 report where we talked about the concern, like poor look at number 2, poor adult fish passage due to upstream barriers at the Shasta River and the Hole in the Ground Ranch. The dates that it's taking place is from October to December of a given year when the adults are trying to migrate in. Here's the proposed solution is to modify the downflows in the stream and improve access. And so we went through one at a time and we laid out what these limiting factors were and looked at, so this one here, Bridgefield Springs, That's what we were just looking at. Improve fish passage, maintain sufficient flows and water quality, provide access to the rearing habitat. None of that's going on. And so as a result, you've got what potentially could be a real coho producing section of the watershed that is instead is producing, it's a point source of pollution. Montague Water Conservation District, which is also a co-signer on the Safe Harbor Agreement, is releasing its stored water for prior water rights into the channel, and it is swamping those springs and making it unfit for coho to operate, turning it into optimal, suboptimal, and detrimental temperature range, low dissolved oxygen, high phosphorus levels. Prior water rights that is coming out of the Juvenile reservoir should be released in a pipe. It shouldn't be, that stuff doesn't belong in the channel. It's in the summertime, it's not fit to be in the channel. This is taking place on the Department of Fish and Wildlife's property. This was the Louis Ranch. It then was owned by the Nature Conservancy Ranch. It's now owned by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there's barriers to keep the fish from getting to the springs, the big springs area. This is an old water wheel structure that serves no purpose now except allows pipe to go over the top of it. This thing needs to be modified so that fish can get above it. Little Springs has same thing. It's got cold water. These are impoundments that are warming the water. And then we've got barriers to migration. The department's talking about doing something with it, but as it stands right now, the impoundment by itself, this is 13-degree water coming out there where the pointer is. By the time it gets to number 7, it's already up to 19. It's in the suboptimal. So this is starting out at 13 degrees. And by the time it reaches the confluence here, I'm sorry, the upper end of it is 19 degrees by the time it gets to the culvert there at site 6. So impounding water is the worst thing you can do for cold water because it's just gonna, I mean, a little bit of it's okay, but the larger the impoundment, the more solar radiation it's going to accumulate. Increased smolt survival requires adult access to spawning habitat. That's a given. It requires suitable conditions during egg incubation and early rearing. Requires access for the age 0 fish to over summer cold water rearing habitat. It requires passage to the Klamath River for the 1+ smolts. And it requires coordination between diverters and resource managers, which hasn't been able to occur. Safe harbor agreements include insufficient measures to increase the number of smolts produced to sustain the population. We know that the current monitoring plans are not designed to inform which measures and agreements are working to improve coho survival. I wanted to run back to a slide here, if I can do that without making everybody motion sick. This guy right here. So in this last year, the current year that we're in, right, well, is 2021. So we had 728 smolts produced by the Shasta River. That's the estimate from the rotary trap. That's what came from the 50 adults that were produced. That's a smolts produced, 14 smolts produced per returning adult. The last time this brood year, this cohort came back in 2000, brood year 18. I'm getting my brood years and my juvenile years mixed up. Brood year 16, 52 fish came back and they produced 4,236 smolts. 2019, 50 fish came back and produced 728 fish, smolts. So you can see that's one generation difference. You've dropped from 4,236 down to 700. 728 smolts, if you're lucky, you're going to get 2% survival on those fish coming back. And that's going to equate to 14 adults. So in one generation, you went from 81 adults down to an expected 14 adults. This is what I was talking about with the extinction vortex. The population is collapsing, and the measures that they're trying to sell us with the safe harbor agreement aren't doing anything to change that. You know, you could monitor in the watershed where you were dropping these fish out. Why is it that only 728 smolts are produced from those 50 fish? We're in the watershed because if you have antennas, you can tell what part of their life history these fish are not surviving, like Chris did with his antennas. but that's not a part of the safe harbor agreement. It's just like, we're going to do these good things, and then they'll kick in, and like, it's a magic thinking. Somehow it'll all take effect. I had the analogy, I was talking with this morning, a friend, and it's kind of like if you have an old car and it's not working, you're gonna put air in the tires, or maybe you'll put in an air freshener, or maybe you'll armor all the sidewalls. But dang, it still doesn't work. You're spending money on it, you're waxing it and doing stuff to it, but it still doesn't run very good because you haven't focused on what's not working in. And that's what's missing with the safe harbor agreement. The nuts and bolts of why these fish aren't surviving, we know that. We know what they need in terms of temperature and habitat. But this plan, it's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. And everyone I think I'm talking to here is a resident of Siskiyou County. And we have just as much say, I think, in what happens with this river. We don't want this thing locked up for 20 years with an agreement that can't be modified. That's just that's basically just a phony effort to try to do things. And the writing's on the wall here with these monitorings, with the numbers of these fish. I think as citizens of Siskiyou County, that we have as much right as anyone to say, hey, we want something real. We don't mind, working with the ranchers or doing a safe harbor agreement, but let's make it something that's genuine and not something that's just going to be just for show. And that's what I see the safe harbor agreement is. I'm not doing it service by getting into all the nuts and bolts of it, but we can tear it apart and talk more about it, and other folks can do just as well. But really hold the feet to the fire and say, how are you guys going to grow more fish? How are you going to produce more juveniles? If you don't produce more juveniles, you're not going to bring more adults back. That's where they come from. And they're saying, well, maybe we'll do a propagation program. Maybe we'll bring coho in from someplace else. How are those fish going to do any better than the wild fish? They're going to encounter the same barriers to survival. So I'm grossly over time, and I apologize for doing it, but this is something that I really feel like needs to be in the public view. And you guys are the public, and you're citizens of Siskiyou County. I think that we don't want some kind of a lame fake program on our river. We want a river that we can actually be proud of and enjoy and feel good about.